Roman society redirects here. For the learned society, see Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies. The culture of ancient Rome existed throughout the almost 1200-year history of the civilization of ancient Rome. The term refers to the culture of the Roman Republic, later the Roman Empire, which at its peak covered an area from lowland Scotland and Morocco to the Euphrates. Life in ancient Rome revolved around the city of Rome, its famed seven hills, and its monumental architecture such as the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Forum of Trajan, and the Pantheon. The city also had several theatres, gymnasia, and many taverns, baths, and brothels. Throughout the territory under ancient Rome's control, residential architecture ranged from very modest houses to country villas. And in the capital city of Rome, there were imperial residences on the elegant Palatine Hill, from which the word palace is derived. The vast majority of the population lived in the city centre, packed into insulae. The city of Rome was the largest megalopolis of that time, with a population that may well have exceeded 1 million people, with a high-end estimate of 3.6 million and a low-end estimate of 450,000. Historical estimates indicate that around 30% of the population under the city's jurisdiction lived in innumerable urban centers, with population of at least 10,000 and several military settlements, a very high rate of urbanization by pre-industrial standards. The most urbanized part of the empire was Italy, which had an estimated rate of urbanization of 32%. The same rate of urbanization of England in 1800. Most Roman towns and cities had a forum, temples and the same type of buildings, on a smaller scale, as found in Rome. The large urban population required an endless supply of food, which was a complex logistical task, including acquiring, transporting, storing and distribution of food for Rome and other urban centers. Italian farms supplied vegetables and fruits, but fish and meat were luxuries. Aqueducts were built to bring water to urban centers, and wine and oil were imported from Hispania, Gaul and Africa. There was a very large amount of commerce between the provinces of the Roman Empire, since its transportation technology was very efficient. The average costs of transport and the technology were comparable with 18th-century Europe. The later city of Rome did not fill the space within its ancient Aurelian walls until after 1870. 80% of the population under the jurisdiction of ancient Rome lived in the countryside in settlements with less than 10,000 inhabitants. Landlords generally resided in cities and their estates were left in the care of farm managers. The plight of rural slaves was generally worse than their counterparts working in urban aristocratic households. To stimulate a higher labor productivity, most landlords freed a large number of slaves and many received wages. Some records indicate that as many as 42 people lived in one small farm hut in Egypt, while 6 families owned a single olive tree. Such a rural environment continued to induce migration of population to urban centers until the early 2nd century, when the urban population stopped growing and started to decline. Starting in the middle of the 2nd century BC, private Greek culture was increasingly in ascendancy. In spite of tirades against the softening effects of Hellenized culture from the conservative moralists, by the time of Augustus, cultured Greek household slaves taught the Roman young. Chefs, decorators, secretaries, doctors, and hairdressers all came from the Greek East. The Roman cuisine preserved in the cookery books ascribed to Apicius is essentially Greek. Roman writers disdained Latin for a cultured Greek style. Only in law and governance was the Italic nature of Rome's accretive culture supreme. Against this human background, both the urban and rural setting, one of history's most influential civilizations took shape, leaving behind a cultural legacy that survives in part today. Social structure. The center of the early social structure, dating from the time of the agricultural tribal city-state, was the family, which was not only marked by blood relations but also by the legally constructed relation of patria potestas. The paterfamilias was the absolute head of the family. He was the master over his wife, his children, the wives of his sons, the nephews, the slaves and the freedmen, disposing of them and of their goods at will, even having them put to death. Slavery and slaves were part of the social order. The slaves were mostly prisoners of war. There were slave markets where they could be bought and sold. Roman law was not consistent about the status of slaves, except that they were considered like any other movable property. Many slaves were freed by the masters for fine services rendered. Some slaves could save money to buy their freedom. Generally, mutilation and murder of slaves was prohibited by legislation, although outrageous cruelty continued. Apart from these families and the slaves, there were plebeians that did not exist from a legal perspective. They had no legal capacity and were not able to make contracts, even though they were not slaves. To deal with this problem, the so-called clientela was created. By this institution, a plebeian joined the family of a patrician and could close contracts by mediation of his patrician paterfamilias. Everything the plebeian possessed or acquired legally belonged to the gens. He was not allowed to form his own gens. The authority of the paterfamilias was unlimited, be it in civil rights as well as in criminal law. The king's duty was to be head over the military, to deal with foreign politics, and also to decide on controversies between the gens. The patricians were divided into 3 tribes. During the time of the Roman Republic, Roman citizens were allowed to vote. These included patricians and plebeians. Women, slaves, and children were not allowed to vote. There were 2 assemblies, the Assembly of Centuries and the Assembly of Tribes, which were made up of all the citizens of Rome. In the Comitia Centuriata, the Romans were divided according to age, wealth and residence. The citizens in each tribe were divided into 5 classes based on property, and then each group was subdivided into 2 centuries by age. All in all, there were 373 centuries. Like the Assembly of Tribes, each century had 1 vote. The Comitia Centuriata elected the praetors, the censors, and the consuls. The Comitia Tributa comprised 35 tribes from Rome and the country. Each tribe had a single vote. The Comitia Tributa elected the quaestors and the patrician curule. Over time, Roman law evolved considerably, as well as social views, emancipating family members. Justice greatly increased, as well. The Romans became more efficient at considering laws and punishments. Life in the ancient Roman cities revolved around the Forum, the central business district, where most of the Romans would go for marketing, shopping, trading, banking, and for participating in festivities and ceremonies. The Forum was also a place where orators would express themselves to mold public opinion, and elicit support for any particular issue of interest to them or others. Before sunrise, children would go to schools or tutoring them at home would commence. Elders would dress, take a breakfast by 11 o'clock, have a nap, and in the afternoon or evening would generally go to the Forum. Going to a public bath at least once daily was a habit with most Roman citizens. There were separate baths for men and women. The main difference was that the women's baths were smaller than the men's, and did not have a frigidarium or a palaestra. Different types of outdoor and indoor entertainment, free of cost, were available in ancient Rome. Depending on the nature of the events, they were scheduled during daytime, afternoons, evenings, or late nights. Huge crowds gathered at the Colosseum to watch events like gladiators, combats between men, or fights between men and wild animals. The Circus Maximus was used for chariot racing. Life in the countryside was slow but lively, with numerous local festivals and social events. Farms were run by the farm managers, but estate owners would sometimes take a retreat to the countryside for rest, enjoying the splendor of nature and the sunshine, including activities like fishing, hunting, and riding. On the other hand, slave labor slogged on continuously, for long hours and all 7 days, and ensuring comforts and creating wealth for their masters. The average farm owners were better off spending evenings in economic and social interactions at the village markets. The day ended with a meal, generally left over from the noontime preparations. Clothing in ancient Rome, the cloth and the dress distinguished one class of people from the other class. The tunic worn by plebeians like shepherds was made from coarse and dark material, whereas the tunic worn by patricians was of linen or white wool. A magistrate would wear the tunica angusta clava. Senators wore tunics with purple stripes, called tunica latticlava. Military tunics were shorter than the ones worn by civilians. The many types of togas were also named. Boys, up until the Festival of Liberalia, wore the toga praetexta, which was a toga with a crimson or purple border, also worn by magistrates in office. The toga virilis, or man's toga, was worn by men over the age of 16 to signify their citizenship in Rome. The toga picta was worn by triumphant generals and had embroidery of their skill on the battlefield. The toga pulla was worn when in mourning. Even footwear indicated a person's social status. Patricians wore red and orange sandals, senators had brown footwear, consuls had white shoes, and soldiers wore heavy boots. Women wore closed shoes of colors such as white, yellow, or green. The bulla was a locket-like amulet worn by children. When about to marry, the woman would donate her bulla to the household gods, along with her toys, to signify maturity and womanhood. Men typically wore a toga, and women wore a stola. The woman's stola was a dress worn over a tunic, and was usually brightly colored. A fibula would be used as ornamentation or to hold the stola in place. A palla, or shawl, was often worn with the stola. Food. Since the beginning of the Republic until 200 BC, ancient Romans had very simple food habits. Simple food was generally consumed at around 11 o'clock, and consisted of bread, salad, olives, cheese, fruits, nuts, and cold meat left over from the dinner the night before. Breakfast was called ientaculum, lunch was prandium, and dinner was called cena. Appetizers were called gustatia, and dessert was called secunda mensa. Usually, a nap or rest followed this. The family ate together, sitting on stools around a table. Later on, a separate dining room with dining couches was designed, called a triclinium. Fingers were used to take foods which were prepared beforehand and brought to the diners to be handled with fingers. Spoons were used for soups. Wine in Rome did not become common or mass-produced until around 250 BC. Wine became more commonly produced around the time of Cato the Elder, who mentions in his book De Agricultura that the vineyard was the most important aspect of a good farm. Wine was considered a staple drink, consumed at all meals and occasions by all classes, and was quite cheap. However, it was always mixed with water. This was the case even during explicit evening drinking events, where an important part of the festivity was choosing an arbiter bibender who was, among other things, responsible for deciding the ratio of wine to water in the drinking wine. Wine-to-water ratios of 1:2, 1:3, or 1:4 were commonly used. Many types of drinks involving grapes and honey were consumed, as well. Mulsum was honeyed wine, mustum was grape juice, mulsa was honeyed water. Even the notoriously strict Cato the Elder recommended distributing a daily ration of low-quality wine of more than 0.5 gallons among the slaves forced to work on farms. Drinking non-watered wine on an empty stomach was regarded as boorish and a sure sign of alcoholism, whose debilitating physical and psychological effects were already recognized in ancient Rome. An accurate accusation of being an alcoholic, in the gossip-crazy society of the city bound to come to light and easily verified, was a favorite and damaging way to discredit political rivals employed by some of Rome's greatest orators like Cicero and Julius Caesar. Prominent Roman alcoholics include Mark Antony, Cicero's own son Marcus, and the Emperor Tiberius Claudius Nero, whose soldiers gave him the unflattering nickname Biberius Caldius Mero. Cato the Younger was also known as a heavy drinker, frequently found stumbling home disoriented and the worse for wear in the early hours of morning by fellow citizens. During the imperial period, staple food of the lower-class Romans was vegetable porridge and bread, and occasionally fish, meat, olives and fruits. Sometimes, subsidized or free foods were distributed in cities. The patricians' aristocracy had elaborate dinners, with parties and wines and a variety of comestibles. Sometimes, dancing girls would entertain the diners. Women and children ate separately, but in the later Empire period, with permissiveness creeping in, even decent women would attend such dinner parties. Education, schooling in a more formal sense, was begun around 200 BC. Education began at the age of around 6, and in the next 6 to 7 years, boys and girls were expected to learn the basics of reading, writing and counting. By the age of 12, they would be learning Latin, Greek, grammar and literature, followed by training for public speaking. Oratory was an art to be practiced and learnt, and good orators commanded respect. To become an effective orator was one of the objectives of education and learning. Poor children could not afford education. In some cases, services of gifted slaves were utilized for imparting education. School was mostly for boys. However, some wealthy girls were tutored at home, but could still go to school sometimes. Language. The native language of the Romans was Latin, an Italic language in the Indo-European family. Several forms of Latin existed, and the language evolved considerably over time, eventually becoming the Romance languages spoken today. Silver Age Latin was the most popular. Initially a highly inflectional and synthetic language, older forms of Latin rely little on word order, conveying meaning through a system of affixes attached to word stems. Like other Indo-European languages, Latin gradually became much more analytic over time and acquired conventionalized word orders as it lost more and more of its case system in associated inflections. Its alphabet, the Latin alphabet, is based on the Old Italic alphabet, which is in turn derived from the Greek alphabet. The Latin alphabet is still used today to write most European and many other languages. Most of the surviving Latin literature consists almost entirely of classical Latin. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, Greek was the main lingua franca, as it had been since the time of Alexander the Great. While Latin was mostly used by the Roman administration and its soldiers, eventually Greek would supplant Latin as both the official written and spoken language of the Eastern Roman Empire. While the various dialects of Vulgar Latin used in the Western Roman Empire evolved into the modern Romance languages still used today, the expansion of the Roman Empire spread Latin throughout Europe, and over time Vulgar Latin evolved and dialectized in different locations, gradually shifting into a number of distinct Romance languages beginning in around the 9th century. Many of these languages, including French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and Spanish, flourished, the differences between them growing greater over time. Although English is Germanic rather than Romanic in origin, Britannia was a Roman province. But the Roman presence in Britain had effectively disappeared by the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasions. English today borrows heavily from Latin and Latin-derived words. Old English borrowings were relatively sparse and drew mainly from ecclesiastical usage after the Christianization of England. When William the Conqueror invaded England from Normandy in 1066, he brought with him a considerable number of retainers who spoke Anglo-Norman French, a Romance language derived from Latin. Anglo-Norman French remained the language of the English upper classes for centuries, and the number of Latinate words in English increased immensely through borrowing during this Middle English period. More recently, during the Modern English period, the revival of interest in classical culture during the Renaissance led to a great deal of conscious adaptation of words from classical Latin authors into English. Although Latin is an extinct language with very few remaining fluent speakers, it remains in use in many ways. In particular, Latin has survived through ecclesiastical Latin, the traditional language of the Roman Catholic Church and one of the official languages of the Vatican City. Although distinct from both Classical and Vulgar Latin in a number of ways, ecclesiastical Latin was more stable than typical medieval Latin. More classical sensibilities eventually re-emerged in the Renaissance with Humanist Latin. Due to both the prevalence of Christianity and the enduring influence of the Roman civilization, Latin became Western Europe's lingua franca, a language used to cross international borders, such as for academic and diplomatic usage. A deep knowledge of classical Latin was a standard part of the educational curriculum in many Western countries until well into the 20th century, and is still taught in many schools today. Although it was eventually supplanted in this respect by French in the 19th century and English in the 20th, Latin continues to see heavy use in religious, legal, and scientific terminology, and in academia in general.